Theodore. He's a tugboat and a friendly tugboat too. A friendly tugboat too. Oh, Theodore likes to do the things that friendly tugboats do. Pushing and a pulling in the great big harbor, in the great big world is so much fun. So many brand new things to discover. Waking with the sun, gotta get the job done. Oh, Theodore and Emily, Bodak, Hank and George and the harbor master too.
Rough weather was blowing up and down the coast, and a blanket of thick fog hung over the harbor. The dispatcher called all the tugs into the great ocean dock. Theodore was the last to return. He had a very strange look on his face. "Is something the matter, Theodore?" asked Emily. "I think," said Theodore, catching his breath, "I think I saw a ghost." "What did he look like?" asked Hank. "Tell us, Theodore." "I didn't really see it that well. It was out near Shipwreck Rock. I saw a small ship. That is, it looked like a ship, only it was a ghost." "Well, how did you know it was a ghost?" "It made a strange sound. Ding, ding." Hank was so startled he bumped right into George. "I could see right through it, and it was floating in the air above the water." "There are no such things as ghosts," snorted George. "You probably just saw a big wave from the storm." "George is right," said Bodak. "It was just a big wave." "George is always right," added Hank. George felt good. It felt good being the tug who was always right. But Theodore was still upset. "I did see a ghost ship," he said quietly. "I know I did."
Oh, George. Why do you always have to be such an ignorant ass? You really shouldn't let this always right stuff get to your head.
Agreed. There was no reason to bring down poor Theo like that. Come on, George, for real? But anyway, the dispatcher then sends George out to Shipwreck Rock after reports of trees in the water. But as George cruises along, he then begins to hear a very strange sound.
What was that? George heard a strange sound, like a small bell. Ding, ding. He floated a little closer. It was a small ship, but not like any ship he had ever seen before. Its mast was cracked and crooked, and its hull was rotten and rusty. George thought he could see right through it. But the strangest thing of all was that the ship seemed to be floating in the air above the water. And it seemed to be calling to him. "Ghost!" cried George. "Ghost!" And he turned and headed for home as fast as his engine would take him.
What's this? Running away scared? Not so tough now, are you, Georgie? Anyway, a very worried George returns to the dock, and the dispatcher wants to know if the harbor is safe. With the ghost on his mind, George tells the dispatcher he should have another look.
"Well, sir," George began, "I'm not sure. I think I'd better have another look at that ghost. The coast." "Very well, George," said the dispatcher. "This time I would like Theodore to go with you. Take the salvage barge to collect anything dangerous you find in the water. That is all." But Theodore can't come with me." "Why not?" Because the harbor is safe. I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon." "George," said the dispatcher, quickly losing his patience. "First, you said you weren't sure if it was safe, and now you say it is. You will leave immediately with Theodore and not waste any more time. That is all." George set off feeling miserable. He wished he hadn't been so quick to tell Theodore that he was wrong about the ghost. Then he wouldn't be going out again right now, out to where George was sure the ghost was waiting for him.
Well, you did this to yourself, George. If you didn't open up your big trap, you wouldn't be so worried about your ghost, now would you? So Theodore and George head back over to Shipwreck Rock, towing Bobby Barge this time. And of course, that ghost is still on their minds.
We're almost at Shipwreck Rock, Theodore thought to himself worriedly. That's where I saw the ghost. George was worried too. I hope I don't see the ghost, he thought to himself. Theodore, said George out loud, you wait here. I'll check to see if the ghost is clear. I mean coast. There may be some big trees in the water that were hit by lightning. I mean lightning. George headed towards Shipwreck Rock. But as soon as he was out of sight of Theodore, George stopped his engine and just floated silently, listening. Foghorn? Seagull? Waves in the rocks. George was naming all the sounds he heard. All the good old familiar, not a ghost sounds. Meanwhile, Theodore floated along by himself, naming all the things he saw. All the good old familiar, not a ghost things. Shadows. Dock. A scary rock. Another foghorn, said George. Boat whistle. Ghost. Ghost! Shouted George. That strange sound belonged to the ghost. George raced to where he had left Theodore. Theodore was nowhere to be found. Then George had a terrible thought. Maybe Theodore saw the ghost. Or maybe the ghost saw Theodore. Suddenly something bumped right into him. Oh! Cried George. Then he saw it was Theodore. Where were you? Asked George. I was worried about the ghost, admitted Theodore. I did see one, even if you don't believe me. Well, I've inspected everything, and the ghost is clear. I mean, the coast.
Yep, it seems Georgie may be realizing that, just maybe, Theodore was right about the ghost after all. But before any more can be said...
What was that? There was that strange sound again. Ding. Ding. And it was much closer now. The tugs realized with a shudder they were almost at Shipwreck Rock. Theodore, said George, looking very unhappy, I have something to tell you. And then, again, there was a strange sound. It was very close now, and it seemed to be calling them. What were you going to tell me? Whispered Theodore. Tell you? Said George. You had something to tell me? Repeated Theodore. Ghost! Cried George. Ghost! Cried Theodore. Come on, Theodore! Just then they heard, Theodore! Theodore! The ghost was calling Theodore. It knows your name, said George. I know that voice, said Theodore. And gathering his courage, he called, Digby? Is that you?
Yes, it is.
The ghost's name is Digby? Said George. That's not a very scary name. Theodore remembered Digby. He was an old cable ship who lived near Shipwreck Rock. Just then, the fog lifted a bit, and the tugboats could see that Digby was sitting right up on top of Shipwreck Rock. So it isn't a ghost, said Theodore. You were right all along, George. Now, George was about to say that Theodore had been right about the ghost. But now, there was no ghost. That meant George could still be the tug who was always right. So George didn't say anything.
Wow, George. Still trying to keep your reputation intact? What a... So after learning that all along it was Digby, the tugs help him back into the water and all head for home.
Digby the cable ship was stuck on Shipwreck Rock, and we got him down with the crane. Good work, said the dispatcher. We were getting worried about you. In fact, we had almost given up the ghost. Theodore had a very sad look on his face. George was right, he said. There really was no ghost. It was just Digby. George could see how upset his friend Theodore was, and suddenly he knew he had something to say. He took a deep breath.
I thought there was a ghost, too,
Said George.
when I was out near Shipwreck Rock.
He began.
The sky was filled with big, dark clouds. When suddenly, I heard a strange sound.
Sound? What kind of sound?
Ding, ding.
Hank was so startled, he bumped right into Emily. The other tugs had to laugh. George told everyone the rest of his ghost story, which really wasn't a ghost story. And do you know something? George found out it didn't feel so bad being the tug who was sometimes wrong. Not so bad at all.
And that concludes George's Ghost. Alright, David, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm telling you, it's one of my favorite episodes. George is awesome in this episode, even though he was kind of a... I also love the fact that this was one of the first spooky episodes since Theodore's bad dream. And I gotta say, it left a big impression. Honestly, it was a little creepy. Also, this is the first time we ever get to see Digby, one of Taylor's personal favorite characters, I might add. Also, a special mention in the beginning of the episode. I absolutely adore this one. Telling the story of the Flying Dutchman sets the tone of the episode very nicely. There were one or two minor gripes, but overall, I can honestly say this is one of my favorite George stories.
This episode had a very similar feel to a Thomas episode. Just your sort of typical story where one character thinks they see a ghost, another claims there isn't, only to find out that there is no ghost in the end. Simple, yes, but it's still pretty good. For characters, George is his usual self, passing himself off like he knows everything. However, I do appreciate how this personal experience helped George to see that whether such things exist or not, it's really not so bad to admit when you're wrong sometimes. And it was very wholesome of him to back Theodore up after realizing that there was no ghost. As for Theodore, I do feel bad how he was just immediately rejected by the others for thinking he saw a ghost. I'd probably react the same way as he did, as I myself am a firm believer in the paranormal. Also, viewers are introduced to Digby, which, if you look closely at his model, he's made from the very same rusty wreck seen all the way back in Season 1. Pretty cool, huh? But I gotta say, I was a little disappointed that this had to be Digby's introduction. Because I'm not buying the fact that Theodore just knows him all of a sudden. And the other disappointing thing is, this is Digby's only speaking role of Season 2. Shame we won't be hearing him for a long while. But for the visuals, we get to see a little more of the layout of Shipwreck Rock, which kudos to the team for making it look spooky with all that fog. And for music, Graham really did a number on the spooky music throughout this episode. It still manages to give me goosebumps. If you want a good laugh from a silly little ghost story, this is definitely the episode you all have to check out. Up next is Theodore Changes Sides.